Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And hello to everyone, obviously here, but also online. So I want to thank everyone who has helped this happen, obviously our colleagues that introduced, and Errol for being here as well. So in the time available to me, I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for a conversation. And really this is a talk about the notion of the context of injustice and what that means for museums. So in 2013, the German Museums Association issued a guidance around this notion of context of injustice that said that that notion should inform assessments of how we think about objects in museums. But importantly, it said that those contexts were not only in the past, but also could include a context that continued to have an effect into the present. So I think as we look back on that guidance another 10 years on, that question of the unfinished nature of certain sort of contexts of injustice now finds itself at the center of debates that are about the legacies of empire, about scientific racism, in inverted commas, and about the theories that we inherit from the past over cultural supremacy. So the reactions against those, how to deal with those legacies, include the African-led movements of the fallism movement and the restitution movement. We've seen it include unnaming buildings and streets and even lectureships or professorships, and the wider conversation over how to decolonize what we teach. But it also here in London includes the non-removal of Geoffrey at the unnamed Museum of the Home, and even in Berlin has seen the active installation of a Protestant cross that has gone on to Humboldt Forum there. So really I want to ask two questions here that build on but move on from the book that we heard about earlier, the Brutish Museums, that was about the arguments for the return of the Benin bronzes. So I want to ask in the first half of this lecture, how should we define the context of injustice of colonial legacies by the standards of the time or by the values we hold now in the present? And then in the second half of the lecture, I want to really look at what it means to dismantle the infrastructure of enduring colonialism that's in the arts, in the heritage, in the education and the museum sectors. So we hear a lot about the decolonization of our museums, and I think it's worth historicizing that notion. And we can reach back in the literature to, if you like, the Tuck and Yang observation that decolonization is not a metaphor. We can reach back further to Audre Lorde's sort of observation that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, that we need to think hard about the methodologies and the disciplinary framings that we have and how they are part of the problem we're trying to solve. But we might also reach back even further to Fanon, and hear actually his observation in his essay on sort of racism and culture, where he makes, I think, a crucial distinction for us in between what we might call, what he calls vulgar racism, the racism that's focused on sort of the body, on arguments over science and nature, the notion of sort of difference between people as having some biological difference or basis. But then he says in the 19th century, really soon alongside that vulgar racism, a second sort of racism emerges. And that's the one with which we're only now really here in Europe and America, I think, starting to come to terms, which is cultural racism. He talks about the expropriation, the spoliation, the raids, the murders, the sacking of cultural systems that were forms of racism on a cultural level. How do we come to terms with those legacies? How do we work with what Fanon says we need to do, which is to think about racism in the field of culture? So the Rose Must Fall movement, as it emerged in South Africa in 2015, I think helps us to think about this, because Rose Must Fall, of course, was a generational moment. This was a point at which, after the end of apartheid in 1994, there were students at the University of Cape Town who found themselves in 2014, 2015 as 20-year-olds or as 19-year-olds who continued to experience the institutional racism and also the everyday racism there at UCT that was part of that legacy of apartheid. So the argument there was that the image of Cecil Rhodes, the cultural image, the artwork at the heart of the campus, was a part of how that worldview had been made to last and made to endure. So writing at the time, Achille Mbembe in 2016, here's a reference as well to his most recent book, which I absolutely recommend to everyone here. He talked about that moment as a negative moment. And a negative moment, as he says, is one in which old antagonisms remain unresolved, but new ones also emerge. How, at that point, then, are we able to demythologize whiteness? How can we physically deconstruct that image of Rhodes that normalized and naturalized that form of cultural supremacy, that form of inequality, using art and culture and the academy in order to do so? Now, of course, anyone that's read Fanon would not be surprised by the fact that we're talking about statues and racism because, in the early 60s, he was writing already about the notion of later colonialism as a world of statues, the statue of the general who led the conquest, the statue of the engineer who built the bridge. Every statue, every colonizer erected that was on the colonial terrain never stopped repeating the same single message: we are here by the force of our bayonets. And of course what we learn is that locatedness happens in the metropole as well as at the margins of empire. Here is Cecil Rhodes outside Oriel College, holding in his right hand the slouch hat of the imperial yeomanry. He's in the suit of the businessman, but he might as well be holding a machine gun in his right hand, really, in terms of what this image means. So my colleague Semukai Chigudu wrote in The Guardian about his experience of being part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, that he was surrounded in Oxford not by the ghost of colonialism, but by its living dead. This thing is not dead. It continues in the present, as the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford movement observed, as that observation, that South African-led movement that pointed out the enduring nature of empire, found its way to Oxford, where, of course, there are these images of Rhodes. But, of course, at All Souls College, there was the Codrington Library, there was Rose House, there was the Old Indian Institute. These images of empire and supremacy were built physically into the built environment, and of course into the Pitt Rivers itself, which is where I work in the museums. So that sense of those normalizations of these worldviews being built into our lived environment, of course, in a Berlin context, has been absolutely at the heart of attempts also to rename streets. So this is the main argument I want to get across here, really, I think. And, I mean, without sort of rushing to a conclusion, let me just sort of let me put my cards on the table at this point. My argument is that we're at a generational and an international fundamental shift in how we think about and understand the past. Historically, we could say that we are moving, as we look back in the 1890s, with the translation of Ranke into German, there is a moment of sort of Rankian empiricism, wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it really was. That's what we're looking for from our history, that continues through to Hugh Trevor Roper's injunction in the 1950s that a historian must love the past, that idea of history as fact coming together with a certain form of pride and of nationalism, being replaced really interestingly in the decolonial context of the 1960s with a sort of relativism, not a pastness but a presentism. We might go to E.H. Carr on his notion of freeing oneself from the dead hand of the past, or one might look forward to notions that the past, is interpreted, that we receive the past and we make of it what we will, that there might be multiple readings of the past, a multivalency for the past, a cosmopolitanism and a multiculturalism, whereby we can all read the past in different ways. And that's maybe where we entered this millennium with, but increasingly we're at a point now where how we think about the past has something to do with endurance and duration. There's an emerging sense of the unfinished nature of the human past, and I think the humanity here is central as well, as lived experience, as memory, as intergenerational, as survival, as endurance. The notion that the past is just as unstable as what we say or write about the past is. So I want to give you 8 things we might read that could help us think about this further. We could go to Edouard Glissant with his notion of tormented chronology, where historical memory was erased, the writer must excavate this memory, that's based on the sometimes latent traces of what they find in the here and now, where time has been fixed in the void of an imposed non-history. The reader must contribute to restoring its tormented chronology, but do such traces and imposed non-histories actually include not only the myth of the wider world as being peoples without history, but also to myths of timelessness, of eternity, or to manifest destiny, such as we see, for example, in images of roads. We could go to Suleiman Bashir Tiagni's reading of Bergson, his attempt to join the dots between Bergson's account of duration and the ongoing histories of colonialism and anti-colonialism through the participatory aesthetics he identifies in the writers that he writes about. To mobilize culture, he argues, is to put culture back into motion. We could go to Anne-Laura Stoller's notion of duress and ruination, the notion that, and she wonderfully writes about dur in French as being a root that talks about hardness and endurance, and also that notion of being forced, sort of duress, how empires ruined, contour and carve through the psychic and material space, where people live, and what compounded layers of imperial debris do to them. Her book seeks to sound an alert to the uneven temporal sedimentations in which the imperial formations leave their mark. At the heart of this is the idea of ruination as a process rather than imperial ruins as received in the present. And she uses the Walcott poem, which I'm not going to read to you, but that one line, "The rot remains with us, even though the men are gone." We could move forward to the crucial report written for Macron by Sarah Savoy, at the heart of which is an account of consent. This is often overlooked when the restitution argument is put, but at the heart of this report, for me, the most important part of it, was the argument that the project of restitution must interrogate the relationship in between colonial law and heritage extraction, and with it the question of the consent or lack thereof. So that's about consent in the present, as well as was this object taken with force against someone's will? What about the will in the present? We can go to Christina Sharp's incredibly important book, In the Wake. The wake is another way of talking about what survives in the present. The wake as the recoil of a gun. Racism, she writes, the engine that drives the ship of the state's national and imperial projects, cuts through all of our lives and deaths inside and outside the nation in the wake of the purposeful flow. Wake, the track left on the water's surface by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming or moved in water, the air current behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow, wake in the line of the recoil of a gun, wake, the state of wakefulness or consciousness. So we're talking wake, not woke here, as you will have noticed. We can go to Nicole Fleetwood's important book from just a year and a half ago, Marking Time, where she introduces the notion of a carceral aesthetics, where she's looking at art in the age of mass incarceration in America and people making art actually in prison. She talks about how artistic making can transform the penal time, the time as a punishment, the turning of the punitive regulation of time into some form of aesthetics, that penal time exists within centuries-long practices of dispossession and of captivity that join the dots between enslavement, imprisonment, and those modes of display that we see in the museums and the galleries. We can go right up to just a week and a bit ago, wherein the summing up of the acquittal of the Colston Four, the judge made the point that at stake here was whether the defendants have honestly believed that the city council was committing the crime of publicly displaying indecent matter, or displaying a visible representation which is abusive within the sight of a person likely to be distressed by it. That leaving a statue up and not doing anything about it can be a form of abuse. And we could, number 8, think back to the Lawrence inquiry, to the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, in 1993, and the Macpherson report, that crucially found, despite what we heard from the Sewell report last year that simply tried to say this wasn't true, nothing is more important, I think, at this moment in the UK than remembering that we have yet to come to terms with the outcomes of Macpherson, that of course introduced the idea of institutional racism, that pointed out that the failures in the investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence was not only about overt racism, but unwitting and collective racism. We might say that the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s was at the heart of it about saying that racism has a history, and that history, of course, in the civil rights movement at that time that was being pointed to were histories of enslavement, histories of invasion. Today, we still have to come to terms with the ongoing history of racism, in this case, far more recent layers from the 19th century and also early 20th century. So we're halfway through, and I now, in the second half of what's available, of the time available to me, I want not only to talk about how we might define the temporal limits of how we think about contexts of injustice, but also to ask what it means to dismantle the infrastructure of enduring colonialism, across these sectors. So let's start in Berlin. Let's start in the transition from the Berliner Schloss to the Palast der Republik to the Humboldt Forum. So the Prussian Imperial Palace is demolished after being sort of bombed in the Second World War in 1950. In its place, the Palast der Republik is inaugurated in 1976. By 2006, The Economist could write that with only a skeleton of steel beams left inside after the asbestos had been stripped out, this has become a cool venue for parties and exhibitions, not a verdict that one would hear, I think, in The Economist about what's on the site at the moment, because the Palast der Republik was demolished in 2006 to 8. In 2021, finally, the 800 million euro Humboldt Forum, reconstructing an image of the Prussian colonial palace at the end of Unter den Linden, was partially opened. It's a monument to the Humboldts. It's a new exhibition space for the non-Western art which was previously out west in Dahlem. So that controversial sort of decision not only to rebuild a colonial Schloss, but to put your anthropology collections in it, was partially justified, it was argued, that this was a forum. This was a monument fundamentally to the idea of debating the legacies of empire. But they didn't debate the asbestos when they removed it. They just removed it. In what sense is this any different? The board resignations that we've seen now is the start of a set of parallels that we're seeing happening between London and Berlin. In 2019, the resignation of Ardaf Suef from the Board of Trustees of the British Museum, which was you can read it in the LRB. One of the most important observations there was that the British Museum is not a good thing in and of itself. It is good only to the extent that its influence in the world is for good. And that echoed the more direct, in some ways, certainly linked back to that point I just made about asbestos, the point made by my colleague Bénédicte Savoy in her resignation from the Humboldt Forum Advisory Board 2 years earlier. Das Humboldt Forum ist wie Chernobyl. This is like Chernobyl. We deal with the legacies of empire as if this was radioactive waste. And we see that observation borne out in the nature of the protests that are increasingly held around both Humboldt Forum and around the British Museum, which are linked in that sense that extractivist colonialism has been allowed to persist, actively nurtured in these institutions. These are colonial institutions reimagined and actively rebuilt in the present. So the call to defund the Humboldt Forum is about seeking to share out this massive resource into grassroots organizations who will deal with these legacies that Humboldt Forum says it will do in far, far more direct ways, in that they will not rebuild but will dismantle those legacies. And again, the campaign around the BP sponsorship which is at the British Museum, has made really fascinating connections in between extractivist colonialism in the past, stolen art, related to stolen land, stolen climate in the present, that BP and the BM have this common unfinished history that relates to forms of extractivist colonialism. So campaigns for returns, of course, whether Bernie Grant outside the Museum of Mankind in 96 to 97, or the important campaign for the call to bring back and Gonzo that's ongoing at the present outside Humboldt Forum, those of course have been a central part of that, but whether in my institution at the Pitt Rivers or in the image of this Cameroonian object here, which is a photograph that I took in November, and the sign in front of it, those protests are not yet being mentioned within the displays here, and certainly the physical dismantling that would involve restitution has yet to begin in these institutions. Instead, what we saw in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was a doubling down and a reimagining and indeed a mythologizing of the idea that institutions like the Pitt Rivers, institutions like the British Museum are somehow universal museums. The sort of 2002 Declaration of the Importance and Value of Universal Museums, which was signed by the directors of these self-described universal museums, all of which, of course, happen to be in the Northern Hemisphere, happen to be in Europe and America, nonetheless argued they serve not just the citizens of one nation, but the people of every nation. That notion of world heritage, as it developed most obviously, but also has been elsewhere in the world, but as we saw especially at the BM and at the Humboldt Forum in 2017 to 18, suddenly fell into sharp relief in the summer of 2020 when, as ArtNet put it, this is performative. The idea that these institutions could make statements around the Black Lives Matter movement while arguing that restitution wasn't, and any of the changes that were being called for were actually, you could retain this image of the Universal World Culture Museum. That was seen as incredibly difficult by so many. So at this moment, we find ourselves at a fascinating diversion, point of sort of movement in different directions between Berlin and London. So here are some, actually until this lecture, I think, unpublished notes, excerpts from the Memorandum of Understanding on museum cooperation between the German Foreign Office and the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments, signed on the 13th of October last year, which includes the commitment that the process of return of the Benin bronzes, and we're talking here the more than 1,000 objects from more than 30 museums across sort of Germany, the process should start with the transfer of the property of these items to Nigeria and commence at the latest in the second quarter of 2022. That both sides share the view that the process of the return of the Benin bronzes should not be delayed, neither by the provenance research that might happen or the delay of the digitizing the bronzes. And both sides intend to facilitate the ongoing circulation of cultural objects. Having handed over ownership, you can, of course, continue to exhibit world culture, just on a very different basis. So with the landmark restitutions of the French, by the French to Benin in the November of last year, we see a fundamental difference, how far the world has changed from here on the left-hand side in 2006, where you could still have the Times newspaper arguing that even human remains being returned was controversial because it was a loss to science, compared with this wonderful reminder that restitution is never a loss because it's a gain for the nations, for the communities, for the institutions that receive them. Here are photographs of the return of some of those objects to Benin, and importantly what Benedict said at the time, just as there was a before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so there will be a before and after the return to Benin of the works looted by the French army in 1892. Europe's arrogance towards the legitimate desire of Africans to reconnect with their heritage is now a thing of the past. Warning, however, and this is, I guess, the final section, the final points I want to make. The Humboldt Forum is looking to appropriate your critique, argue the coalition of the cultural workers against Humboldt Forum. And a visit to Humboldt Forum, I'm afraid, underlines that. You walk into the ethnographic galleries and you see images foregrounding the looting. Actually, this is a photograph from the Pitt Rivers collections of the looting of the Benin bronzes. And then the first text with which you are presented reads, "I have a white frame of reference and a white world view." This is a line, although we're not told until we get further in, from Robin D'Angelo's book, White Fragility, the subtitle of which is "Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism." And that notion that it's really hard for white people is at the heart, really, of a particular kind of reflexivity, self-awareness, that was the 90s fix, what actually our colleague in America wrote recently was the Boasian fix, the notion of Franz Boas in anthropology that argued that anthropology was somehow inherently multicultural. But that fix as being, well, if we are aware of our histories, aware of ourselves, if we're reflexive, then that's enough. But in reality, what that's doing at Humboldt Forum is re-centering the same old anthropologists. These supposedly open storage vitrines are in fact monuments, new monuments, to the explorer Friedrich Wolfs and the anthropologist Adolf Bastian, not monuments, not even mentioned the people from whom they took those objects in the 1860s and 1880s, between the 1860s and the 1880s. And here, at the heart of this, I think we need to understand what's going on through the lens of the work of Sylvia Wynter. So Sylvia Wynter's notion of what she calls monohumanism and the overrepresentation of man argues that in the 19th century, this is going back to Fanon's idea of cultural racism, the crisis for whiteness that happened in the wake of abolition, in the wake of emancipation. How is supremacy how is white supremacy going to operate after those momentous events? Well, actually, there's a model of the human, a model of humanity, liberal humanism, where the trick is that the human is the same old white guy that was the problem in the first place. As she wrote in 2003, our Western bourgeois conception of the human man over-represents itself as if it were the human itself. So anthropology museums were always, from the start, from the 1870s, they were about the myth of cultural whiteness, just as much as they were about the myth of the primitive or the inaction of alterity. So reflexivity serves to recenter this guy Anthropos, the anthropologist, the universal figure of the human, while retaining all the power in these centres of cultural whiteness. Retain and explain, such as we see here shamefully at Oriel College at my institution, yet more centering of roads. Another monument, here it is, you can just see it here at the bottom, this sort of interpretation panel, in order to contextualise roads. It's a fourth monument to roads on that site. So I think we can learn from this by looking at the equestrian statue of William III, wrapped in fragile tape, on the first day of the trial of the Colston Four. Wrapped up, of course, because, of course, Edward Colston transferred a large segment of his original shareholding over to the king when he came to power. But that fragility we see as well in the work, in the curatorial gesture. So to put Colston in the harbour is one thing. To fish him out and put him on display for debate is, as I argue in my piece in Art Review, a form of counterinsurgency. We don't debate asbestos. We don't debate Chernobyl. We don't debate racism. So here at the Pitt Rivers where I work, one of the challenges, the emerging challenges, I think, for those that work in cultural institutions like this, is to recognise how we're enacting monohumanism in very specific ways. Simply to take my own position at the Pitt Rivers, one has to do more than simply state one's sort of privilege and positionality. In this conversation, I bring a lot of privilege based on the institution I work for, my whiteness, my maleness, all of that. But one has to do more than just self-consciously make oneself aware of that. We have actively to try to find ways to undermine or dismantle that. And one way is to point out the difference, the sort of double consciousness between the naming of the museum after Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, named to such a degree that he's even on the signposts around the town when you drive around, and then the unknown number across the museums in the UK, maybe more than 100,000 human beings represented in the colonial collections on display, and mainly in the storerooms in the form of human skulls, human bone, hair, fingernails, preserved human body parts of all imaginable kinds, not to mention the many modified human remains that are part of other sorts of objects. So this war on culture has a history, and its history is the history of cultural whiteness as monohumanism, the use of museums, statues, and other forms of art in order to tell the story of white cultural supremacy. So when the Prime Minister says that vandals can't change our history, and when he tweeted in the response to the falling of the Colston statue that we cannot pretend to have a different history, that fundamentally leads into my conclusion, really. We can think of having another history. We can choose, surely, who we remember, what we remember. So to answer my own two questions, how should we define those sort of contexts of inequality, of injustice? We can do so with a new sense of duration, of legacy, of the unfinished nature of empire, which is both terrifying, because it's here in this room, it's in this institution, it's in this part of London. with all these museums around us, it's in institutional racism in that kind, but it's also incredibly hopeful because we don't know how this ends. It's not over yet. But then the second question, what does it mean to dismantle this infrastructure? It's not just about giving back the Benin bronzes. It's about seeking to find ways, collaborate, in order to find ways to dismantle what Winter calls monohumanism, to abolish. That work of abolition is not over, because we need to abolish exclusionary structures of cultural whiteness. In Germany, there's a lot to be positive about, as Claudia Roth, the new culture minister, calls for a public dialogue about decolonization. She told Die Zeit on the 8th of December this last year, if you want to build an open forum, then it shouldn't radiate paternalism and dominance and exclusion. She told another interviewer just earlier this week, we must get the discussion about colonial crimes out of the ivory tower of the academic seminars and bring it into public consciousness. We need a much broader discussion about what accountability means. She's absolutely right, but the challenges for us include so much more. Our museums and galleries, our universities, and our historic built environment, the environments in which we live, are central public spaces for having this urgent conversation. But who will be part of these dialogues? Just earlier this week, the team of my colleague Albert Kouafo from Cameroon, an academic group, were refused entry to Germany because they couldn't get their Schengen visa. And you'll read about this in the German press this week. But this is fundamental. The border regimes are part of this same process. And the children who are dying in the English Channel and the many people who die in the Mediterranean every year are part, again, of these unfinished frameworks and structures and infrastructures that we're talking about. So I just now want to finish. I'm going to leave you looking at Edward Colston and make my final sort of comments. So I've argued that there's a very specific historical circumstance that we're talking about here, which is that a certain set of physical infrastructures that relate to cultural whiteness were made and made to last in quite a tight time window between, let's say, the 1880s and the 1920s. It's a sort of proto-fascist history, if you like. And Edward Colston, of course, erected in 1895, falls absolutely as part of that. So restitution and fallism are the necessary work to make art, culture, history that's fit for our times. That's a precondition to new forms of equitable partnerships, new forms of reparation, new forms of repair. The geopolitics that we hear from some politicians will allow us only to think of the world as it is. But art and history will allow us to imagine the world otherwise, will allow us actually to transform the world. That can involve the pulling down of a statue, but it can also involve so much more. So to live in a world that is not a world of statues, to live in a world where we think of humanity beyond the 19th century lens of liberal humanism, within which there was this trick that we've learnt about this evening. An undertaking that involves a notion of the past as durational, in the same way as a work of art might be said to be durational. Maybe history is like that as well. Maybe it's a performance piece of some kind. So and I guess this is my final point, the environmentalists tell us that our job now is to learn how to be a good ancestor. We have to find the toxic things we're making, the things we're leaving behind, and make sure we don't leave a damaged world, a world full of radioactive waste, full of an overheated climate. Leave that for the people that come after it. They're after us. They're absolutely right. But for those of us that work not on nature, but on culture, for those who are not nature writers, but culture writers, maybe the challenge is precisely the inverse. Maybe our job is to find ways of how to inherit what is good from these institutions, from these histories, but excise and destroy and refuse what is not. Maybe our job is now, most urgent than ever, to learn how to be a good descendant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you. That was very powerful. And I just wanted to say to the audience that we're going to just have a couple of questions before opening this out for discussion. We've got about 20 minutes. And I wanted to pick up, actually, Dan, on your final point, in fact, one of your final points, which was about the power of art and the durational nature of art. And you've sort of counterposed that in a way with the type of heritage, the materiality of statues and their permanence. And I know that you have worked with quite a few artists, and I wondered if you could share us a few thoughts about the potential of art to deal with some of the complex questions that you've been actually posing.
Okay, thanks so much, Errol. Yeah, it's a really important point. So yeah, I mean, obviously at the moment, a lot of my work has been focused on questions of restitution. And a lot of, I guess, I mean, this evening's lecture was an attempt, you know, to take some of those arguments we're making about how to dismantle, in a very positive way, you know, those aspects of museums that are hurtful to some of our audience in the present, how to widen that out into a more general sort of conversation. But in terms of art in the museum, that has a crucial role in terms of restitution, because, of course, if you like to return something which isn't yours, you know, in those cases where its return is being demanded, where often these objects are sacred or royal objects of such importance, which maybe in the Western institution are just hidden away in storage or are rather badly displayed, that need not be a loss. It can be a positive, a gain for the recipient community, but also we can think about what to do with the space. So the commissioning of art, and especially contemporary African art in those contexts, I think has a central role. Why is it, so many of my Nigerian colleagues ask me, that if you want to see, you know, African art in Oxford, you've got to see art that's 500 years old or from ancient Egypt? You know, why can't, and yet we have these contemporary art spaces full of contemporary art, but with virtually no sense, so it's mapping itself back onto those same old geographies. So yeah, I think not only anthropology museums, but the whole of the art institution, whole of the art world has a fundamental job here to see part of the outstanding debts, the things we're trying to take apart as not just being stolen objects, but being the exclusionary practices that mean that we're missing out so much. I mean, so much of the best contemporary art at the moment is from the continent of Africa. It would be so wonderful to find ways where, you know, a part of these ways of building new forms of partnership, a more equitable partnership, maybe involves African artists. So I definitely think art, I mean, artists are often ahead of the game on these things, and it can, you know, they're often sort of more than aware of this than the academics and the curators are. So allowing space for artists without art washing. I think that's been one of the great criticisms of Humboldt Forum, and that was one of the concerns there. Watch out, your critique is going to be sort of co-opted. We need to be very, very careful about that.
Thank you. Yeah, that reminds me of Stuart Hall's comment in Whose Heritage about the potential of contemporary art to be transgressive in relation to our idea of heritage. So I think that's really, really powerful. The other question I wanted to ask was about the political level, if you like, and you've talked a lot about Europe and the Humboldt Forum. In a post-Brexit environment, what do you think is the potential from a British point of view, to evolve a kind of European practice or a series of actions at the European level on these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important point. And I guess I should start by underlining how important to me the Oxford-Berlin alliance has been. So the University of Oxford is incredible. We've been building this alliance with the the main four Berlin-based universities, that in the context of Brexit has been such a lifesaver to allow us to continue to have these conversations across European nations. I think so much of the most interesting work happening on these themes is happening by comparing and learning from what's going on in France and Germany and Belgium in the UK. But those dialogues increasingly have to happen not just in isolation in Europe. We have to be foregrounding African voices in these conversations. We have to find ways of overcoming visa problems. We have to find a new form of internationalism rather than universalism. And so really, I mean, the internationalism of these sort of conversations is fundamental. How do we rebuild a politics of internationalism in these times? I think that's crucial, because we've never, if we think about anthropology museums, we've never needed spaces like, the public space of anthropology more than we do at this moment in history. We need, absolutely crucially, these spaces where we can celebrate art, ways of making, ways of seeing, ways of understanding, believing outside of a Eurocentric lens. But that doesn't mean we have to do so on these horrendously unequal terms, or for a project that is seeking to ground itself in cultural supremacy. So I definitely think the European conversations are very positive. And I think the more you have those conversations, especially, given the event today, in between, if we just sort of talk about the Anglo-German sort of conversations, you learn so much by saying, well, in some ways here in the UK, here's something that's happening that isn't happening in the Berlin context, but equally vice versa. We've got so much to learn in terms of the politicians. And I wish that we could have a culture secretary that was anything like what we now see in the German context with Roth. So let's hope, fingers crossed.
Thank you so much. So let's open it out to the audience. We've got about, I think, 12 or so minutes. So, lady with the green top, yes.
Thank you so much. Hi, can I take this off?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and what a moving conclusion. I'd like to talk a little, or hear you talk a little bit more about this idea of the different standards of the past. We saw it in Boris Johnson's tweet, and you also used it as a framing for part of your talk. And I'm sort of thinking about scholars like Priyamvada Gopal, Insurgent Empire, who has very convincingly demonstrated that that isn't the case. There wasn't a different set of standards in the past. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. And this argument is a bit of a tired, or a sort of a sidestepping of the actual issue. So do you have any thoughts on this?
And so absolutely, yes, I do. Yeah, so the first thing is absolutely everyone, as well as the books I mentioned there, certainly should go and read Insurgent Empire by Priya Gopal. Absolutely fantastic book that exactly as you say, not only tells the story of anti-colonialism, but actually makes a series of really important points that, of course, all of us know, it's so ludicrous to be told, don't rewrite history, when, of course, that's what historians do. It's a bit like saying to archaeologists, don't find anything else, or to artists, don't make any new work, just kind of talk about the old stuff. how have we got to this point in this country? And I do think it's a peculiarly, not even a British thing, it's an English thing, it's a Westminster thing, because if you look at the devolved nations, they are way ahead of where Westminster is on this question. If you look at Wales and how they're looking at these questions, Edinburgh or Northern Ireland, a completely different frame. But how did we get to this point? I think it was just, ultimately, obviously, it's fascism, or neo-fascism, or sort of proto-fascism, the idea that the past can never change. But it's also, I think, reminds us that history has so often been written as if it were erecting a statue, and that the timeframes between Rankian historiography and this sort of global thing, certainly transatlantic history of the Confederate statues going up, roads in South Africa, Colston, roads in Oxford, there's a certain way in which one vision of the world was written into history, and they're absolutely right. That if that changes, then fundamental things change, because that model of cultural whiteness that's been written into how we think about the past will be undermined. Yeah, I think it's inevitable. So I just think we can't stop being historians, though.
Somebody at the back there, and then you afterwards.
Thank you very much indeed. My background is as a professional historian. I'm also a dad, and my daughter is just doing A-level history, and I've been following her history lessons right through school. The one thing you didn't mention was about schools education. I am horrified by my daughter's ignorance on these issues because of what she's not been taught at school. It worries me considerably. And putting it in the context of the actions that are taking place, taking statues down, the one bit about Boris Johnson I agree with is the importance of education. The one thing I really, really object to is the fact that his government isn't pushing on education. I wonder whether you might say something about the role of schools education and how it might relate to some of these other actions that you've been talking about.
And so, yes, absolutely. I think, for any history teachers, either online or sort of here, and certainly for parents of those being taught history, absolutely, this could not be a more important point. That so much of this, there's a big Queen Victoria-sized black hole, in our national consciousness, whereby we think of the past. Maybe, so we've got abolition and emancipation, and I think I didn't have time in the lecture to talk about what I think many of us feel was the missed opportunity of 2007, which was the 200-year anniversary of abolition. So many of us in the early 2000s were so positive about this is going to be the moment for museums and education to face up to these histories. In fact, at that time, actually under Gordon Brown, with his idea of kind of Britishness and all that stuff, it turned into a celebratory narrative that it turns into, so the British won abolition, they won emancipation, then you've got the 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, and it's a very positive sort of national story. And then we miss, between emancipation 1838 and the start of the First World War, we're missing, maybe the Crimean War might be in our consciousness, but apart from that, we just miss the fact, even though in every year of Victoria's reign, there were multiple wars against empire. We were building empire with such violence, with such ongoing, what in my last book I called World War Zero. So historical consciousness is central, but I also think, I guess a part of the point of this lecture was to say that it's not only about, so some will say this is just about telling the history and we just need to face up to it, but it's more than that because we're living it as well. We're living with, these histories are not over. So I think facing up to those histories, big part of the reason they're not on the curriculum is that then we'd have not only to be having a conversation that's historical, but one that's sociological and that's anthropological, that's cultural, that's about the present day. So yeah, I absolutely applaud anyone, you know, in the current situation in education who's managing to teach on these questions sort of one way or another.
Thanks for a very powerful talk, and I appreciate very much what you were saying. I just want to express two worries. One is that we're really talking about ourselves, and we're talking about ourselves in this room, which we're all white, we're all European. And we're also talking in an environment in which there is real backlash in flow. And the backlash is around, you know, worries and frustrations and anxieties about decline. You know, the decline of the West, and particularly that we are then seen as... Oh, sorry, okay. Then we are talking about ourselves in this kind of environment, and we're then being, you know, the attitude is, you know, why are you doing this when we're already, you know, sort of in this terrible position and state and whatever. And it will generate quite a powerful backlash, and I think it already is. You know, you can see what's happening with Macron in France, for example. So I think we have to break out of that, you know, concern with ourselves, and how do we actually achieve a greater sense of a unity of purpose in which the dialogue and the way in which the discussion takes place is much more actively global, if you like, or certainly dealing with, you know, sort of the objects of the old colonial masters in a different way from just simply, you know, sort of worrying about, you know, sort of how we were powerful in the past and we are not powerful any longer. And then it comes to a second point, which is really the whole quest in your talk, a concept of injustice. And we're not really talking about, you know, a concept of injustice that would work in many, for example, my own experience in much of sub-Saharan Africa, you know, sort of where the idea of certainly injustice is not so much a product of the colonial things, it's about a product of now, you know, and after all, you know, sort of we can see it with COVID, Gordon Brown is quite right, you know, sort of we have held on to all our, you know, sort of all our stuff, you know, and we still don't redistribute. We're not into redistribution in any way whatsoever. And therefore, we're talking about injustice when we actually don't do anything which has any kind of, you know, sort of real features about injustice, about the working against contemporary injustice now. You know, sort of makes us all ready, just sort of sitting here, you know, hand-wringing perhaps, but, you know, not really doing anything in what is now contemporary injustice. But thanks, it's been a very powerful evening.
Sure, okay, thanks Mike, and hello. Long time no see, very good to see you. So yeah, I mean, I think on that, I mean, I absolutely take both points. Obviously, one of the themes of the talk was that we have to move away from seeing contexts of injustice as in the past and see them in the present, so I think we're on the same page there. In terms of practice, I mean, I guess in some ways both parts of your question relate to the absolutely fundamental question, maybe in some ways as we're moving towards a sort of punchline for all this, a conclusion, the sort of, you know, what do we do question, how do we operationalize this? How does this mean something? Certainly with Bénédicte Savoy and also my colleagues Albert Guaffo, Siraj Rasool, and also Malik Mladel in Cameroon, in South Africa, Senegal. We are working on a major Volkswagen Stiftung project, which is seeking to rewrite or sort of calibrate the conventional forms of inequality through which artistic exhibitions and knowledge is produced. We're aiming through something called an anti-catalogue, through foregrounding the work of the postdocs, one of whom is here in the room, to try to create an exhibition between Oxford and Dakar in 2024 that puts into practice some of this thinking. Where we're talking about equality of resource, we're talking about equality of voice, we're talking about meaningfully undermining these sorts of legacy inequalities. But I think we each seek to do our own thing in terms of what happens practically. At the same time, though, I do, and I guess the main argument of the lecture was that there is a fundamental shift in historical consciousness going on, which means that the pushback's no good, actually, because this is happening anyway. I have no doubt at all that this shift in our historical consciousness could well have forms that are very right-wing, that we need to be very aware of and are very risky. But I certainly think that we don't want to be spending time arguing with the past, which is so often how it feels when we're talking about restitution or not restitution. I mean, I just won't go on panels these days, to debate the undebatable, never mind the indefensible. But there is where the conversation is now, I think, is incredibly exciting, but there are definitely risks. And risks, exactly as Mike just underlined, involve that we don't manage really meaningfully to change anything.
Okay, thank you. One brief, is that? Yeah, one from, okay, right. Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have one question from the live chat from YouTube. Do you think British museums could one day share collections, for example, with Nigeria, with, say, British folk materials for the 18th century paintings? So is that something that you would find an interesting development?
Sure. I think, fundamentally we're at the point now where the work is about giving back what isn't yours when asked. And I think that point, it can't be long. We saw the Times editorial position only on sort of Tuesday this week change in relation to the Parthenon marbles. It changed in relation to the Benin bronzes a year ago. So the giving back of stolen goods, the idea that let's imagine museums where nothing is stolen, I think we're there already. It takes time for institutions to catch up, but we're there culturally. That then, of course, opens up. That's the precondition for so many other exchanges, and exciting ways of reimagining what a museum is in the 21st century. And the globalism, or maybe more accurately, the internationalism that's part of this, these sort of new kinds of interaction. So absolutely, if there's an interest, in Nigeria, in an exhibition about English folk art, fantastic. That's precisely the sort of exchange that we're going to be able to create once the elephant in the room is addressed, and once alongside restitution, the conversations about reparation, the conversations about resource, and the conversations about voice are also addressed.
Great. Thank you. Do we have time for one? One more. Yes, one more. Okay, great. Okay, the gentleman at the back there.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. You put the Bristol crime up as part of your presentation. And there's something about giving back or taking back. Why is it, or should the West be involved in the decision-making process at all? Is it rather that the countries and individuals from which things have been stolen should be simply taking these things back? The Berlin Wall wasn't dismantled, it was torn down.
Okay. I think it depends really whether you see the removal of Edward Colston as an act, or how you understand that act. I attended my first event to get rid of the old racist bastard in 1999, 1998 even, I think it might have been. And there was a 25-year process, which was my generation, actually, that failed to try to do the sort of civil society, the English heritage, historic England, sort of working with the council, working with all those usual formal processes, and it simply, because of merchant venturers, because of sort of whichever vested interest it was, simply didn't happen. The formal process didn't work. So that's a unique example, though, and I think it's so important that with all of these restitution claims, with all of these questions over the toppling of statues, it's a case-by-case approach. I mean, the people in sort of Bristol in the June of 2020, they didn't hate statues, like all statues. They hated racist statues, or one particular racist statue that had been erected with such sort of malintent, that was continuing to enact that violence in the present. So in terms of what that means for restitution, is the toppling of Colston a model for restitution? Well, Fallism, is an African-led movement that has existed since the 60s and 70s. Think of Algeria. Think, of course, of the Rose Must Fall movement in Cape Town. So too is restitution. I mean, the first objects were returned to Benin, as early as 1938. So I think we have to remember that these movements are African-led movements, that the way in which the demands can be acceded to need not be violent or performative in the same way. In some ways, they can often be very boring. They can be administrative. They can, as I've argued in the book, they start with the very boring curatorial work of making lists. So I'd say, really, there's a way in which one might write a book as if one were, or indeed make a list, or curate a museum as if one were tearing down a statue. And that's what I'm interested in, I think, in all of us thinking about doing next.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thank you all for your great questions. We can continue the conversation afterwards. Upstairs, there's going to be some refreshments. But before we do that, thanks again, Dan, for that very, very, helping us to think that this is not just about the past, it's about the present. Please show your appreciation to Dan.